Hello, thank you for joining us today. We will be starting in 1 minute. Excellent. Well, welcome to this online session hosted by INCAE Business School in partnership with the United Nations Institute for Training and Research, Unitar. My name is Aide Tejada, and I will be your moderator in this webinar. Today, we are pleased to have with us Sophia Simmons and Professor Alberto Trejos, with whom we will be sharing the session about negotiating in international settings. Before we begin, we're going to verify that the sound is working properly. So I will appreciate if you can all go to the question section in Zoom and tell us where you're listening from. This section is at the bottom of the menu, and you can go ahead and write to us from there. Okay. Very good. We are already getting confirmations. Perfect. Great. Very good. Fantastic. So let's begin. Allow me to briefly walk you through today's agenda. First, we will have a lecture on negotiating in international settings with Professor Alberto Trejos. And then we will have some Q&A at the end of this conference, so you can write your questions in the question section in Zoom. After, we will facilitate some information about the Executive Diploma in Business Leadership and International Affairs, designed and delivered by Unitar and INCAE. Now, without further ado, let me introduce you to today's speaker. Professor Alberto Trejos holds a PhD in economics from the University of Pennsylvania. As an academic, he has been in the faculty of Northwestern University and INCAE Business School, where he served as dean and also as director of its policy think tank, the Latin American Center for Competitiveness and Sustainable Development. He has also published extensively in both academic and technical journals, mostly on monetary economics, macroeconomics, international trade, and development. As a policymaker, in his native Costa Rica, he has served as Minister of Foreign Trade, and in that capacity, he led the negotiation of DR-CAFTA, the trade agreement with the United States. Without further ado, I will leave you with Professor Trejos.
Thank you, Ide. Thank you, Sophia, for everything. And let me just put on a presentation and begin. And I don't know, I'm not crazy about the title they gave you. So I played hooky with the title last night. I think that the main point of the talk is about the big importance that global institutions have, and that international agreement that emerges from negotiation not only is a very valuable tool in dealing with things that are of importance for the world, little things like trade and peace, for instance, but also is an essential tool if we want to deal with some of the problems that the world is facing right now, ranging from pandemics to especially climate change. And I'm going to talk, I guess that's who I am, right? I'm a trade negotiator. I led the Costa Rican part of the negotiation with the United States. I also played similar roles in Costa Rican negotiations with other countries and with other partners. And I was a green room minister in the in the sad demise of the Doha round in the WTO. And I'm going to speak as a Costa Rican. When I say that, I mean as somebody that comes from a country that is very small and whose power in conventional meaning, in a conventional sense, its size, its economy, its military is non-existent, but which has been able to represent itself internationally well. So in a world of diplomacy, we fight above our weight, to put it like that. And I think that there's an interesting reminder of what, for small countries, international cooperation and international agreement means. Right? I'm going to also speak as somebody from a generation. And when I say that, I mean somebody who grew up in the Cold War, somebody who has been exposed to what non-cooperation looks like, and who never thought until fairly late in his life that I would get to see non-cooperation rear its ugly head to the extent that it has in the last few years. Thanks to several, in my opinion, negative leaders from here and from there. Finally, it's unavoidable. I'm an economist. It doesn't get cured. It's a chronic disease, and that means I tend to think of things in that funny way that economists find so practical and other people find so annoying, and that's probably going to permeate throughout the conversation. Two main points, the two takeaways. The first one is that there is a very large role for international cooperation and for international institutions. And when I say international cooperation, I do not mean some countries whose people are more fortunate helping out some countries where people are less fortunate. Cooperation partly means that, but it mostly means different countries working together to solve common problems or to solve global problems or to achieve global objectives, right? And that has an enormous frame, right? Much of it through governments working one with the other, or societies working one with the other, but some of it through international institutions. And the world has a healthy endowment of international institutions to enrich itself from. And it has also a couple that are missing. But the other point is that for some problems, it is becoming essential to deal with them through the kind of instrument that a negotiated, incentive compatible, and binding agreement or international law makes possible. And every one of these words matters, right? Negotiated matters. Incentive compatible, that is that given that I entered that agreement and given what the agreement represents to me, it is in my interest to comply with what I committed, not only to expect others to comply with what they committed. And binding, meaning that there are consequences to non-compliance, that there are consequences to quote unquote breaking the law, as if it was a law, which obviously is a problem because for much of international legislation, framing things in a way that is binding runs into, among other things, serious judicial and constitutional considerations in many countries. Two reasons for this. One, on the left, right? International relations are key. Some issues in life are simply international. Some issues in life simply involve different nations, different governments, or even private individuals or private companies from different countries, right? And what this means is that in those matters, to the extent that they can work out well or work out badly, to the extent that we can achieve a better result together, there is a room for international relations. There's a room in those relations for international negotiation. And there is a room within that negotiation for international institutionality. Obviously, on matters like war and peace, and while on those particular topics, in general, agreements are not binding, they don't have teeth. It's also undoubtable that over the years, a lot of conflict has been avoided, domestic conflict or international conflict, simply through the role of international cooperation and of the framework that the global institutions provide. On a more day-to-day matter, gains from trade are enormous. The potential differences in productivity for societies, and therefore in the income and the ability to solve needs for the people in those societies. Simply coming from the fact that the resource allocation is more efficient if I export some things to you and you export some things to me than if I self-supply and you self-supply. And those gains from trade that in some of my academic research have been estimated for the average country in the world at 45% of their potential output, which is not negligible. Those gains from trade require the participants in the trade, which are typically private individuals, private companies, to encounter in countries rules that are favorable to that trade. And often, even though it is not necessarily, according to theory, it does not necessarily need to be a reciprocal thing. It helps if it's a reciprocal thing. If we have some kind of rules and institutions that guarantee that I condition my trade policy to your conditioning your trade policy, and through those conditions we generate situations in which trade is a lot easier to emerge and to be mutually beneficial. And that particular chunk of international relations, which is the one in which I have some expertise, right? Trade agreements, WTO, European Union, regional integration, bilateral investment treaties, that kind of thing, is another big chunk of what can be done. It's also a big chunk of what can be done, not only because of the value of the topic, but also because of the example of the instruments. Trade negotiations were the first piece of international law to have teeth. In other words, to be binding in the sense that I mentioned before. Finding a solution to some of the judicial and constitutional problems associated with making international law binding. And I believe that what you get from there can be applied into other topics. Third, issues of convergence, issues of development. The world's output is not a zero-sum game. On the contrary, the poorer my neighbor is, the worse off I am. I hope for my neighbors to be better off. I hope for the rest of the world to be better off, not only because I'm a decent person, but also because I am better off if the rest are better off. Therefore, there is a global interest in convergence. There is a global interest in countries becoming more prosperous, and in particular in the poorest countries in the world to catching up with the richer countries in the world. And that kind of effort can be very aided by diplomacy and international law and international institutions. And perhaps the best example is the European Union. The average entrant to the European Union has, in the following 2 decades, in the cases where 2 decades have elapsed, caught up 20 points, 20 percentage points in whatever gap they had in income between what they had at the beginning and the richer countries in the group. In other words, for example, Belgium started the European integration in the 1950s having 70% of the income of the Netherlands, Germany, and France, and 20 years later it had 90%, and so forth and so on. The average country has gained 20 points, and only 2 countries in the European Union have actually fallen behind rather than caught up in the entire membership, meaning that sometimes these instruments are very powerful tools for convergence, for the gaps between countries to become smaller, to the benefit of both parties. We also have challenges that come from the fact that we have an integrated world. That wanted or not, the transportation cost, the communication cost, and the language difference between us has shrunk so much that I can hold this webinar today from my home in Costa Rica, and you guys are all tuned in. But more importantly, that it has fallen so much that we now share a number of things. We share ideas, we share culture, we share information, we share interpersonal communication. In addition to that, enabling that we share markets, that we share technological developments, and also that we share problems. And that poses challenges because obviously it is a topic for the state in every country to deal with some of the matters I just mentioned. And if those matters are becoming international, then we want to think of them international. And we want our governments to coordinate with other governments for some of those matters. Finally, in that column, we also have the challenges of problems that move, of people that migrate not for personal reasons, but for societal reasons, of wars that move from one place to another, of problems in general that move from one place to another. And in those cases, when problems move around, we need to work together. And therefore, there is a value for international relations. But more important than that, Perhaps the two problems of our time, the two largest problems of our time, are pure global externalities. Are problems in which my actions not only affect whether I have the problem, but rather whether others have the problem, meaning they're an externality. And they're purely global in the sense that what is done here affects as much what happens to the neighbor next door as to somebody on the other end of the planet. This pandemic, and hopefully not very soon, but the next pandemics are a very good example of this. The moment we had a patient zero, the moment we had a critical mass of people with the contagion, that we knew that it was going to go exponential. In that moment, we knew that we were going to have the disease in every country in the world. And that wouldn't have been any different if patient zero had been in any other country in the world. In this case, yes, you happen to be you, or you're in your country. I happen to be me, and I am in my country. And patient zero happened to be somebody in Wuhan, in China. But if patient zero had been in Antwerp, or Lagos, or Sydney, or Topeka, or San Jose, the process would have gone pretty much the same way. The problem is entirely global. Same thing with climate change. The problem is entirely global. Climate is going to change. Things like what's happening today in my country, outside my window, would be happening exactly in the same extent as a consequence of the fact that I put an extra ton of carbon in the atmosphere, or the fact that you put it at the other side, in the other end of the world. These problems, neither viruses nor molecules of carbon see the border. They move easily across the border, so easily that policy becomes, to a large extent, not local but global. And when you have a global problem, you need a global solution. When problems are pure global externalities, coordination in how you confront them is critical, is key. Much of what we missed in this time around, much of what we suffered in this pandemic, was the fact that international cooperation was at a low point. For 40 years, it had not been that weak. For 40 years, it had not been that put in doubt by some of the major countries in the world. And that weakened our response. And if the response had been global rather than local, probably the consequences would have been very different. So we are at a time where these issues need to be talked about. We are at a time when the kind of things that we could discuss in the classroom, virtual or face-to-face, on these general topics, if we actually take the time and sit together, are becoming more and more important things. And the kind of things that are going to be in the Unitar INCAE program are going to be more and more essential. Obviously, to think about things globally, we run into some obstacles. The biggest obstacle, perhaps, is sovereignty. What makes laws work at a local level is not only that most people want to comply with the law, and most people feel a moral compunction about violating the law, but that all people know that violating the law has consequences, and that those consequences make them rethink the cost-benefit analysis of whether to follow the law. I don't want to steal my neighbor's television set or hit his children. I would feel very guilty if I did it. I don't need it to be illegal for me not to do it. But if I wanted to do it, the fact that I could end up in jail, that there's a police system, a judicial system, and a prison system waiting for me if I break these rules, would come into play. And that's a problem in global matters, because typically domestic law and domestic constitutions prevent, over the sovereignty, for the sovereignty reason, prevent creating rules that have the equivalent of the policeman, the judge, or the prison. Right? You cannot subject your country to punishment. That's treason in most laws, and that's an issue. How do we create mechanisms for international cooperation that are binding? That is, that countries feel there's consequences from not complying and want to comply, and that yet do not invoke a penalty system that would violate sovereignty. We run into another big obstacle, which is that, of course, all politics are local, and that in the end, politicians, and I used to be one, when push comes to shove, we're thinking of the people that vote for us, and we're not thinking globally as much as we are thinking locally. And locals, when they make their decisions, when they decide to follow you, when they decide to support you, when they decide to like you, are not thinking of global issues alone. They're mostly thinking of local issues. And therefore, even if there is a global good to be achieved, there is also a local issue to be raised. And that local issue will prevail if we all depend on the will of the people. We need something that goes beyond the will of the people. We need something that captures the will of the people sometimes to create something that ensures that cooperation will happen all the time. But this is a difficulty. The tribal instinct is very difficult. And to tell you the truth, after what happened in the 1930s and the 1940s, I spent my entire life thinking, this is not going to happen again. Political leaders appealing to the tribal instinct to gain power in a manner that is based on hatred is something that I thought was on the way out from the species. I thought we were better than that. I thought that whatever gene makes us to be tribal, and it's obvious why, in the conditions in which we live 150,000 years ago, being tribal was a big advantage. That gene had to be selected. But I thought that gene was buried way below all the spirit and soul, way below all this rationality, way below all these rules and laws, way below all this history, tradition, and achievement. Turns out it isn't. And the tribal instinct is often what is appealed to essentially break international cooperation. The tribal instinct means that when you try to divide us between them and us, you're going to be successful. And the them could be the foreign people, the them could be the other government, the them could be the world in that process. And we need to run into this obstacle. And again, I think it's an obstacle that has become tougher. Simplicism and short-termism, the fact that we like to think of matters in simple ways and that we like to think of what happens tomorrow is a problem, because typically international cooperation and the creation of the institutions and the rules that then materialize in international cooperation, we are dealing with complex topics, and we're dealing into things that go way beyond tomorrow, that go into the years, into the decades, and perhaps into the large pieces of centuries. And therefore, again, it's something that we have to fight with. And finally, these things are not easy to come by. International negotiation is a complex art. I'm not going to talk much about that today. I'm not going to complex almost at all. But the balance of powers and the balance of interests that are associated with international negotiation are complex. Agreement is sometimes not found, even when there's mutually beneficial agreement on the table. Sometimes we do not find the way to it. I'm absolutely convinced that in September 2003, when the Doha round of the WTO, for instance, was coming to an end, what we had in that room was a potential agreement that was good for everybody, and that everybody would have liked better than the status quo to which we had to revert if we didn't agree. Nevertheless, because the negotiation is technical, it's personal, it's confrontational, it's tricky, it's complex. Sometimes, even though the agreement exists, we don't find it. And that is an issue that is very important. Again, it's an issue about which I'm not going to speak much to you today, but to which I really hope to get a chance to speak to you guys later on when you hook up into the course or into the program. I'm going to give an example to this kind of thing, and it's going to be the WTO, simply because it's a nice object to play with. So, what are we talking about? We're talking about GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. It starts out as an agreement among a few countries, all of which were very pro-trade, reaching an understanding to keep under certain limits their tariffs, which were the principal trade barriers, on manufactured goods, which were the goods they were trying to trade. GATT at the beginning starts out like the smoking club in campus, right? You can, every once in a while, the students come to you and ask you if you can give them some money and a room so they can do something funny, right? The ping pong club or the debate club. And once somebody came and said, there's a few of us that really like to smoke cigars. Can we make a smoking room? I said yes. I even gave them some money for furniture. They set up the smoking room, and at the beginning, they did not have the problem of anybody in the club reminding the others that you're not allowed to smoke on campus. Because if you don't like to smoke cigar, you don't join the smoking club. God was like that. At the beginning, there were so few countries members of the agreement. The agreement was so simple, and the member nations were so convinced that this was a good thing, that the consensus rule was a good enough rule. If we all agree that I cheated, including me, then I have to change my behavior. Embarrassment, you guys telling me I'm cheating was bad enough, right? And sometimes when you have a strong enough consensus in a group, that's all that you need. However, it began evolving more and more topics, more and more complex topics. So now we're not only talking about tariffs, we're also talking about all kind of border rules. Now we're not only talking about manufacturers, we're also talking about agriculture. Now we're not only talking about 23 countries, we're talking about 160. Now we're not only talking about countries that are convinced that this is a good thing and just want to comply with it and would be embarrassed to be fined in its compliance. Now we're talking about countries with all different kinds of opinions and positions and objectives that have joined for different reasons. Just like what happened to the smoking club when they got a very nice TV and the World Cup came, and a bunch of non-smoking students wanted to join the club to watch the games in that screen. You can imagine that first game, one of them said, hey, you're not allowed to smoke on campus, right? Same thing. When you have a more heterogeneous membership, things need to be written down. And this meant that over the years, the GATT has evolved not only in the topics it contains, and not only the type of interest that it manages, but also in the fact that it has a dispute solution unit, a dispute based on a dispute solution understanding, a process by which, if I am in miscompliance, others can appeal and start a process that can lead into my facing consequences that make me prefer to comply again. Now, this is very valuable because it goes around the sovereignty principle, right? How is it that we can enter into agreements in which there are punishments for us? And that's because this is a major loophole that was found in the issue. Trade lends itself to this. I'm giving you all these concessions in exchange for you giving me all these concessions. What is the consequence if you think I am not complying? You ask for a commonly agreed arbiter to decide whether that is happening. And then if it is happening that I'm not giving you some of the concessions that you'll be giving me, that arbiter helps you find a set of concessions that you were supposed to give me that now you can remove, because all the concessions were conditional on the concession on the other side. So the punishment does not come from outside the agreement. There's nothing like the cop, nothing like the judge, a little bit, and nothing like the jail. Still, the thing is incentive compatible. It is in my interest that I comply, not because I believe in it, not because I'll be embarrassed if I don't, but rather because I lose things of value to me if I take away from you things that I am entitled to have. World Trade Organization, since the creation of the DSU, has had now upwards of 550 panels. Panels mean judicial process that reached to the end. I've been a judge in the process. It's a very interesting process in which, yes, the judging sounds a lot like a judge, except that the consequences do not really sound at all like a jail. And the process does not seem to have anything that is like the police. Right? It is binding, however. It has developed a tradition, it has a method, and the method and the tradition lead to mechanisms that are incentive compatible. It is in my interest to do the right thing. And there's a very interesting history about this that, by the way, often is illustrated mentioning my country. Way before my time, two of the very first panels in the WTO were raised by Costa Rica. Costa Rica against the United States on textiles. Costa Rica against the European Union on bananas. We're a minuscule country. We have no power, we have no influence, we cannot lobby, we cannot threat, we cannot cajole, we cannot do anything, any like that. But we happen to be right. We convinced the judges that we were right. And because the mechanism, the DSU, is incentive compatible, both the United States and the European Union reversed their policies as a consequence of having lost a panel to Costa Rica. There's no other recourse that a country our size has to invoke or to provoke that outcome. So these things are very powerful, but they're also especially powerful for the small. Right? The biggest kid in the class does not really need the teacher to be present during recess for things to for in order to be safe. But it's the smallest kid, the thin kid, the one that gets bullied around. That is the one that sees a huge difference between the teacher being present and the teacher not being present, between there being rules and not being rules, between having or not having a resource that is binding and that is incentive compatible. Of course, there are problems. In trade negotiations, just like in other negotiations, the multilateral agreement, the one that joins all 160 countries, has gotten stuck, right? Since that fateful afternoon, almost 20 years ago, when we dropped the ball, and I acknowledge that I am one of the guys that dropped it most dropped. It has been impossible to restart a negotiation going to that agreement that we felt was there and we still feel is there, right? So that with all the value of the multilateral system, there has been a growth, at least in trade, to bilateral deals, regional deals. Not only because they can go deeper and do things that multilaterally couldn't be done, like in the case of the European Union, which is a good thing, but also because simply to fill a vacuum, right? Fill the vacuum that since we cannot agree certain things among 160 countries, I'm going to have to agree with them separately with the countries with which I care about the most. And that push has been a dilution it has deviated attention, it has deviated trade too, and it has created some problems, although they have gigantic merits. We have the problem that in all international agreements, there's always missing topics. For me, it was always frustrating that we weren't able to put until today. We have not been able to put environmental matters, environmental issues into the global multilateral trade agreement. I see a huge logic for it. I'm going to talk about that a little bit later on. That sometimes we have unbalanced outcomes. How do you find balance? Especially, how do you find balance if what I'm hoping for you to do for me is not of the same nature as what you're hoping for me to do for you? Because, for instance, if I'm better in this product, we care about your barriers to the entry into my product. I'm not worried about my barriers of your entry of the entry of your product, because your product is not going to enter, it's inferior. So you want something in this product in exchange for something in a different product. How do we make sure that the agreement is symmetric, that it is balanced, that we really got more than we gave, that we all got more than we gave, that we got a deal that really should pass? And sometimes it's a tricky issue. I'm very happy with the balances of the different agreements I've negotiated, but I know that some people aren't. I know that sometimes you're put in a very difficult corner when you're negotiating. Finally, some of these things, some of the most complex international agreements, trade is a nice example, but there's many other examples, simply are difficult to implement. They require a lot of information. They require a lot of prying into what the other country is doing. They require the measurement of complex things. They require the opinion of technicians. They acquire the kind of things that create difficulty. So, of course, all these topics are troublesome. If they weren't, we would need international instruments to begin with. However, we have room. We have room to grow. Even in GATT, even in the WTO, we have room to grow. After the disaster of the Doha round, after the problems that are caused by heterogeneity, after the problems that are caused by the fact that we are 160 countries and we're still deciding everything by consensus. And we're still deciding everything by consensus in a world in which if we don't agree, then whatever you have right now is the default solution that we keep having. So we're stuck, right? And how do you deal with that? How much better has the European Union gotten since their decision rule is not consensus rule? However, can countries accept something that other than consensus rule, where, for instance, by majority vote, the rules get to be something I never agreed to because more countries, but not including me, agreed to it? There are issues there. There's issues in GATT and in all international organizations about the degree of involvement and also the permeability of some of the smaller governments in the world. Permeability because they're very permeable from the outside, right? There are governments who have the habit of when the negotiations become technical, this happens in trading, it happens in other topics, they accept as their technicians because they don't have any of their own, the technicians of certain NGOs from the West, which means that those people, rich technocrats from the West, get some of the power of and representation of governments of countries that are not their own. Is that legitimate? On the other hand, if these governments did not have that support, would the agreements that result without their full understanding and participation be legitimate? And this is an issue because there's countries out there in the world where the population is just 100,000 people. There's countries out there in the world where the educated people are so few that you want to put them into other problems, into curing patients and building bridges, rather than this kind of thing. And therefore, there's many countries in the world that don't get involved, both in the trade negotiations or in other topics, until it's a little bit too late. So yes, we have challenges. We have a challenge of the fact that at some point over the last few years, the guardrails of proper negotiation have been broken. Just like the guardrails of democracy were broken by a few governments in the last few years. There's things that were never written down. There's nowhere written that you don't say you were cheated out of the result, unless you know you were cheated out of the result. It's nowhere written that you tell the winner of the election that you're going to make life impossible for him or her, rather than saying that you promise your party will try to cooperate. It's nowhere written that you invoke your followers not to voting, but to violence and to try to overthrow. It's nowhere written that you don't do those things. It's an unwritten rule. And similarly, just like democracies have unwritten rules and things break down when they're broken, negotiation processes have unwritten rules. And when they are broken, we don't know what to do. I know what it looked like, the wink in your eye when it means you're saying yes to something. And if you later claim you didn't wink, we have a problem. And in general, all these unwritten rules, many of whom were broken precisely during the Doha round of GATT, are valuable, and we don't really know how to continue. So things are complex. But this logic, and in particular the logic of WTO and GATT that I'm telling you, is a logic that could apply for many other problems, and not only for trade problems. There are many issues on which I wish we had a dispute solution understanding. Many issues on which I wish, okay, after the countries agreed on this, if one of them breaks it, they will wish they didn't. There's going to be a consequence that will make them stop, right? And to give you an example, to give you a few examples, global change is climate change is one of those cases. I'm going to illustrate one into those later on. Issues that have to do with peace. I wish they were binding. I wish we could apply some of the same logic of trade agreements. Now, we have also topics in which perhaps what we can do is not to create their own agreements or their own instruments that have teeth, that have binding consequences for miscompliance, but rather that we can put those instruments inside the trade agreements so that we can use already the instruments that have been created for the trade agreements to oversee those topics. And we can use trade consequences, trade punishments as an incentive to comply with other things. And I'm going to talk about one example of that in a moment, right? And we also, I think, need to borrow a page from the EU. We need to be able to move to a stage of history eventually, hopefully, in which countries are able to choose by majority some kind of qualified majority with some definition of majority, rather than by consensus, some key issues in the world. Otherwise, we're going to still have many problems there. Now, I've been asked sometimes, how can a negotiation table be believed to be perceived as balanced? If, for instance, you have consensus as a rule, so anybody engaged or unengaged, large or small, knowledgeable or unknowledgeable, representative or illegitimate, can break the consensus. And I agree, it's a problem. I've also been told many times, how can you have a negotiation table that is balanced when you have on the one side, say, Costa Rica, and on the other side, say, China or the European Union or the United States? And my answer is yes, the negotiation table is not exactly balanced, but look at the floor where that table is standing. That floor is incredibly unbalanced. Yes, The European Union is stronger than Costa Rica in almost every respect. When we're negotiating, we still need to agree. In the absence of agreement, neither one of us has achieved anything. If you remove the negotiation table and look the floor on which that table is standing, the floor of the gigantic gap in power, size, military strength, economic strength, cultural power, on which we live in the absence of a negotiation stance, things are even harder. The small country is even smaller. The big side is even more powerful. So even though small is a bitch when you're negotiating, it's far worse when you're not negotiating. It's far worse when you're in an instance that does not require some kind of agreement and that does not have some form of quasi-legal instruments, right? Negotiation is, after all, a mutually understanding exercise. Yes, once I understand what you want and you understand what I want, your abilities or the situation may lead you to get a bigger slice of the gains and me a smaller slice of the gains, or vice versa. But in the end, it doesn't make any sense for me to push for a government to agree with me with something that then its Congress will not pass, that then its population will not accept. It wouldn't be durable. It may not even ever come into existence. So I really need to understand the other side in the process of negotiation. And that is true no matter how different, especially if they're very different, and no matter how asymmetric the relationship is. So again, I think that this is important, especially for small countries. I'm going to give an example of the kind of thing I'm talking about, which is certainly the toughest issue of our time. Our planet's natural health is in crisis. We have been putting greenhouse gases in the atmosphere at a much higher rate than we have been taking them away for far too many decades. And just like they could have asked me as a final exam in chemistry or in physics when I was in high school, it turns out that if you change the gaseous composition of a body, you're going to change the way in which it absorbs, reflects, or keeps energy, and therefore climate changes. Right? I'm always baffled by people who say that climate change is a theory, when in fact, I learned this in high school. Right? In fact, perhaps back in the 1800s, we had enough knowledge to know exactly the science that is behind this. Right? Now, this is a pure externality, as I mentioned before. It is not the case in other environmental problems. It is not a pure externality. If I manage badly garbage in my county, the people in my county are going to be far more affected than the people in other counties. If I cut down the trees in this mountain, the people downhill from the mountain are going to be far more affected than the people 100 miles away. This case is a pure externality. Right? The more greenhouse gases we put in the atmosphere, it doesn't matter where are they put by whom, the effect on everybody is the same. Meaning that the effect is the same no matter who put it in there. The effect is not the same for all of us. In fact, the vulnerability is distributed with a huge range, with some countries whose very survival may be at stake, and some countries for whom the damage can be expected to be directly much smaller, even though indirectly it could be huge. Now, we have a global agreement on limiting emissions. And thank God, and President Biden, it's alive again, right? It's again an instrument. I'm very proud that not only a fellow Costa Rican, but a co-author of mine was the person who presided the Paris Accord led to those agreements. Right? I'm not minimizing the value of that. I think it's a huge achievement of enormous importance. But it has two problems. Number one, we don't really know if it's ambitious enough. And number two, it is not binding. What happens if I surpass my emission limits? It's not clear. We're going to look at you funny. We're going to criticize you. You may be a little bit embarrassed, but that's all that is going to happen. And that is a problem. So let's think of this problem in a different way. And this is one of the problems of our time. In this graph, I noted that the scale is logarithmic, meaning that when you get to each grid line, you doubled from the grid line from before. And you have in the horizontal axis countries' income per capita, which is some proxy for their level of development, bad proxy, but proxy for the level of development. And in the vertical axis, their emissions of carbon dioxide, which is one of the greenhouse gases in question. As you can see, the relationship is positive, right? The poorest country in the world emits 2 tons of CO2 per inhabitant I mean 2, I forget if it's tons or not, but it emits 2, and the richest country in the world emits 2,000. The richer you get, the more you emit. That's a problem, because that means that if the poorer countries in the world get richer, something that we desperately need, that they move to the right of this graph. They're also going to move up in this graph. They're going to move vertically, not only horizontally, posing a threat to our ability to solve this problem. And we are at a limit of how much carbon we can issue. In fact, we're far above the limit, which means that growth becomes a zero-sum game. That there is a moment in which it is problematic that some countries get richer for other countries who therefore have their survival more at stake. Right? And of course, we could hope that technological change will be quick enough to deal with the problem. This line, this regression line, this blue line in this graph, is not there as a physical law, is there as a relationship that involves that countries have certain technologies, are applying certain practices, have certain laws and certain regulations. And if we get better technologically, we find an alternative to some technologies we use today, that blue line is going to begin to move down. It's going to be possible to have the same income level as before with less emissions. And that is a good thing, but it may not be sufficient. It may be timely enough. It may not be timely enough because it is not obvious how do we, in the face of an externality, reward the investment in that technology sufficiently for that technology to come up at the right time. So we have a problem, but we also have some hope. Part of the hope comes from the fact that this scatter plot of points does not really look, again, each point is a country. This scatter plot does not really look like a line as much as it looks like a cloud, right? Like a band. It has a broad range, right? It seems to be that, for example, around the 1,200 a year income level, it's imaginable that you can have it with emissions of 2. It's also imaginable that you can have it with emissions of 32, even though on average you have it with emissions of 8. And around the 10,000 level, there's countries that do it with 32. There's countries that do it with 256, although the average is around 64, etc., etc. The fact that there is a band gives us hope. What is the hope? Well, let's divide the world in 2 sets of countries, and I made them here red and green. The green countries seem to be behaving significantly better towards this problem. Maybe it's their technology, maybe it's their law, maybe it's their regulation, maybe it's their human behavior. But whatever it is that is causing it, these countries are achieving in 2021, with 2021 technology and 2021 knowledge, significantly lower levels of emission that one can associate with this other lower purple line, and not with the previously shown higher green line. And the gap between the 2 lines is actually quite significant. Notice that at this level is the difference between emitting 600 and emitting 200. It's quite a significant gap. Now, if that is the case, we can actually hope for what happens if we find a way to do what is possible. The fact that the green points are there means that that purple line is possible. If simply everybody who's above the purple line moves down to the purple line. And what we find is that this would be sufficient to cut global emissions by 73%. Or said differently, this would be sufficient for every country in the world that is poorer than Chile, which is this guy here, to catch up with Chile's income level, a lofty 20-something $1,000 PPP per capita, which is almost unimaginable down here in Congo, right? And it'd be possible for all these points to move to the right and therefore up along the purple line if every point that is above the purple line comes down the purple line. Oops. Now, that is encouraging because that means that we are not, what separates us from solving the problem is not technology. What separates us from solving the problem is implementing things that exist, not inventing things that don't exist. And that is, of course, of gigantic importance to the world. Now, another aspect of this problem is that the three richest blocs in the world, China, Russia, and the United States, the three biggest players in this game, are all not only way above the purple line, but also above the blue line. So, hoping on let's everybody try to do it, guys, not really gonna work, because it doesn't really pay that much for most of us to move down to the purple line at whatever effort that requires if one of these three big players cannot be moved. So we need something that is going to encourage them, something that is going to be binding, something that is going to matter to them. What can be done? And I've been advocating for a while that what we need is to put the Paris, Copenhagen, Kyoto-like agreements inside the trade agreements, inside of GATT. It's effective. We have very few instances of rulings by panels in WTO that did not lead to rules again being complied with. It's incentive compatible. And it's incentive compatible simply because trade reprisals can be chosen to hurt particularly the sectors in the violating country that are exceeding their emission limits, which means that whoever is breaking the rule has the biggest reasons to comply. And that alignment of interest is precisely what gives these agreements this kind of teeth. And by the way, it'll be good for the environment, it'll be good for trade and for business as well. Because I have the impression that some of the political obstacles that we had when, for instance, GATT got stuck in its current rules, because we couldn't negotiate our way into the agreement that we could all see on the table, in the imaginary table, of course, but it was there. That perhaps what is going to push us to get to the agreement that is so good for the economy is the political strength that is given by having the environmental agreements in it. So what would be good for the environment, what would be life-saving for the environment, would even be economically good rather than economically costly. Think of that. And that can only be achieved with international negotiation, with international law, with international institutions, with international diplomacy, with international binding legal instruments, negotiated legal instruments. And that is what I hope we get to talk about more later on in the year with those of you that join the program. So this is just the introduction to what I think would be some of the interesting topics I would want to address. And at that, I'm going to stop the presentation. And I don't know if we have time for a question or two or an observation or two. And if not, then yeah, we have 6 minutes left. And if not, I'm just going to pass it right away to Sophia so we continue.
Thank you so much, Professor, for your presentation. I am actually going to pass it right over to Heidi.
Thank you. Very good. I see that we still do not have any questions in the chat.
So let's leave it at that. I hope that we
go ahead and
So let's
please
continue
remember
with the
you can go
program.
ahead and write this.
And I look forward instead then to meet everybody when we finally have the program. Let's hope. Take care, guys.
Thank you very much for such
Sophia,
an insightful. Very good. Well, now we will hear Sophia Simmons, who will tell us a little bit more about Unitar and the program that we will be holding this October.
Thank you so much for your introduction. So my name is Sophia Simmons. I'm a consultant with Unitar's Division for Multilateral Diplomacy. So good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where people are from. So I'm just gonna share my screen briefly. It's a very brief presentation. Hopefully you can all see. All right, so we are working in partnership with INCAE Business School. And on behalf of Unitar and INCAE, I would like to thank you all for joining today's session. I hope you enjoyed the keynote speech and learned something. I certainly did. So I'm just here briefly to speak about Unitar and specifically the Division for Multilateral Diplomacy. So as I said, my name is Sophia Simmons, and I work for the DMD division. So what is Unitar? Unitar is the training arm of the United Nations. We were established in 1963 by the UN Secretary General following the General Assembly. And we were established because it is our core mandate and mission to try to equal the playing field when it comes to international negotiations. We believe strongly that an effective United Nations requires the full and meaningful participation of all member states on a level playing field. So far, just in this past year, we have trained nearly 300,000 beneficiaries, implementing 860 events just in 2020 alone, which was also complicated given the COVID-19 pandemic. We are headquartered in Geneva. However, we also have offices in New York and Hiroshima. So specifically, the Division for Multilateral Diplomacy offers many different courses, many different ways in order to pursue learning to try to make them more accessible. So we do have a core diplomatic training that is meant specifically for diplomats. That's abbreviated here as CDT. We also offer master's programs in joint collaboration with universities, executive diplomas, e-learning, which makes it much easier for people who perhaps can't travel or are working professionals. So we offer these different modes in order to make sure that we can maximize our participation. Our fundamental mandate is to strengthen multilateralism, increase performance in the conferences and meetings convened by the United Nations. So of course, international negotiations can be at their absolute most effective. So I just want to thank you so much for being here, and please do not hesitate to contact me further. My email address is right there below, sophia.simmons@unitar.org, and I'm going to pass it back over to Heidi, who's going to talk more about our joint program. So thank you so much.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Sophia. Very good. So let me go ahead and share my screen so we can look at these. Good. Give me just one moment. Perfect. Now, in the meantime, I would like you to please, and we're going to open a quick poll right now, and I would like you to please mark yes if you would like to be contacted and have a private session for us to share more information about this program, and no if you wouldn't like to be contacted. So those who marked yes will be receiving a message from us and will be able to get that information. Good. Okay, so we are getting the questions. So far, we have 44% of you participants who have submitted their votes. Very good. Perfect. We're going to give a couple more seconds so you can. Very good. Excellent. Can you see my screen? Very good. So the program consists of 3 modules. The first module will be held online. The second module will be held in Costa Rica. Our first module starts in October this year. The second module in Costa Rica will be held in December, and then we expect to finish the program in Geneva, Switzerland, in early 2021. So we are going to hold that third module in Switzerland in February 2021. Very good. So these are the topics that will be covered. Remember that those of you who have marked yes in our poll will be receiving a message from one of our representatives to provide you with more information and answer further questions you may have. Now, without further ado, we appreciate your participation in today's session, and have a very nice rest of the day. Thank you all.